Marvin Gelfand, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not sure if there's anything really mythic in my story, except it goes back 62 years to the autumn of 1940. I won't fill in the Blitz and Wendell Willkie running against FDR for a third term. And the story, such as it is, took place in a sprawling borough by the sea, Brooklyn, but in a neighborhood tucked into the northwest corner on the East River, known as Williamsburg, to distinguish it from Williamsburg, the colonial restoration. Many times, out-of-towners meet me in the way of business and what have you, and they ask me where I came from, and I, of course, get extraordinarily flustered. What am I doing wrong that you don't make me as a New Yorker? And I say, New York? I was born in Williamsburg. And they say I don't have a Virginia accent. Williamsburg, when my parents, very late immigrants to the United States, my mother came with 9 siblings. 2 had come years before, and her parents in 1930. My father had come twice, it seemed. Myths are mysteries, and mysteries are myths. That side of the family never disclosed much. I have the feeling he did something infamous because World War I was involved and the borders changed, and then there was the Russian Civil War, and Lenin attacked the Poles, and, God, it was, terrible. Who knows what people did to survive? So he never told stories like Herbie Kleinman's father, who was a baker with a baker's great belly. I sewed jewels into my underwear and snuck out of Odessa. Herbie, well, that's another story, bakers. So they married and settled in Williamsburg, where my mother's family lived. Where the Satmarim live now, the very pious Jews. We moved out of Williamsburg just as the first were escaping Europe. And my family was not pious in that energetic way. So we lived in the part of Williamsburg that had row houses. Not a tree grows in Brooklyn, Williamsburg. Betty Smith's Williamsburg, the tenement Irish, around Lorimer Street. It's such a hot neighborhood now. I hear people talking about it. My son lives in Williamsburg. My daughter has a club in Williamsburg. To use the old language, Vetig, And they settled into a row house that had been lived in by the Brooklyn bourgeoisie, but had been broken up into not floor-through apartments, but half floor-through. And we lived in a succession of them. And as I grew up, there was something in the air. And of course, as a child, and not a particularly acute child when it came to psychological things, I never figured out what it was until years later. It was as if my parents had had a child before I came along, and that child had died. I was overprotected. And of course, my parents had come here as much out of fear of what had happened, what was happening, and what was likely to happen in Europe. And of course, they escaped the worst of it. There was a mixture of hope, to be sure. America was called the Golden Medina, and people wrote letters back, and there were so many great success stories. David Sarnoff, Eddie Cantor, you could run the list down. But their fears were great. So my mother My father worked terribly hard, left early, came home late, hardly ever saw him. He went along. No bicycle for me. We could afford it. You know, we had boarders who helped pay the rent. Mr. Lichtenstein, who was a watchmaker, retired. So that helped. It wasn't the money, but a bicycle, you could fall. You know. Roller skates? Well, the hills in Williamsburg weren't great, but there was an incline, you know. And you'd lose control, and you'd be in Bedford Avenue and the buses and the few. And playing marbles, you know, was immies, you know, in the gutter. That wasn't dangerous, but I'd be amongst the common ruffians, you know. My parents, you know, were not, they had no pedigree. They were not educated. There were no rabbis in the. But they had a sense of themselves. They had a sense of themselves. I can't think of the proper Yiddish word. It doesn't matter that you lived a fine and dignified life. And most of the people around us, you know, were noisy and sat outside on the stoops in their undershirts, and, you know. So I couldn't do those things. As it turned out, I loved school. And though I was not the master of the streets, the second day I went to PS 122, I came home and said, I will walk to school by myself. 4 blocks, 2 avenues, past the big armory to PS 122. And going to school and coming back, the streets teemed. The list could go on forever. Laundry delivered in big electric-driven trucks with chain drives. The bakeries, Dugan's, delivering rolls. The milk from Sheffield Farms on Hayward Street. I even remember horse-drawn carts. And certainly the Italian vegetable and fruit man came with an old nag, you know, that was just 2 steps this side of the glue factory. And then there were, you know, so many other people, street singers. I remember the cutler. He would come pedaling like a cyclo driver with the big stone wheel in front of him and a bell. And he'd get to the middle of a block, hit the bell. All the mamas knew what the bell meant, and they came scurrying out of the houses with their aprons wrapped around, scissors, knives, and the funny little chopping things that they used for soul food, chopped liver, you know. And you could hear the whirring, screeching noise and the sparks, you know, as the stone wetted the metal. Oh, so much. So the streets were safe and full. Still, no bicycle, no roller skates, no scooters made of a stolen box, you know, attached to old roller skates. The thing I wanted most, because I love books and reading, the boarder taught me Hebrew when I was about 2. I puzzled out the Yiddish paper once I learned you read it from back to front. And English, we didn't have much English in the house, but there were ketchup bottles, you know. And I knew that the books were in this big, to me, very elegant building of red brick and limestone, just a few blocks away, near Eastern District High School and the YMCA, the civic center of that part of Williamsburg. But I couldn't get my mother to walk me over and get the library card, because anything involving public institutions reminded her of Brezhnev's Bugim in Poland, where every uniform meant danger, including the police. and every public office meant procrastination and insult and bribery and curses and humiliation. She wouldn't do it. And of course, walking that way took you to the elevated train on Broadway, just a couple of blocks more, that took the men, like my father, across the Williamsburg Bridge into Manhattan to work, as many of them did, in the garment center. My father was a furrier. So two things frightened her, the man's world and the public world. But I came home from school one day, and I had the ultimate weapon. Teacher says. I listened to the teacher, most of the other kids. Yeah, teacher says, great. Mom, teacher says to get a library card. For some reason, you had to show a gas bill. I guess they thought maybe you could forge rental receipts. And maybe electricity was not as widespread as I thought. Or maybe it was democratic, that somebody who owned a house paid a gas bill as well as somebody who rented. I don't know. But we took the gas bill over and found the appropriate desk. And you had to be able to write your name or print it. And I was frightened. I'd heard they would accept printing because I never had the Spencerian copperplate hand that, of course, all the girls picked up, But my tongue, as I concentrated, I wrote my name, showed the gas bill, and got a temporary library card. 30 days later, the permanent card came. I don't think I took out picture books because words were what I was interested in. I would list them and go over to the big dictionary and schlep the pages over, looking for words, God knows, and at the Globe. This is the coda, folks. But my parents, in silent partnership with this great republic, in which they had the most tenuous toehold, insecure in language and so much of American ways, had gotten me in that unlaminated card my ticket out of ghetto-mindedness. Unknowing, somewhat unwilling, they had given me a chance to satisfy the curiosity, such a powerful instinct for lonely, lost, and rather sullen children. And with it, in time, after Dr. Dolittle and the boys' editions of Kipling and Stevenson and Victor Hugo, I wouldn't have known how to pronounce it then, and Alexandre Dumas, and of course Mark Twain. I haunted libraries, and then it was Dickens and Orwell, Tocqueville. So that in time, and I'm proud of this, I achieved an independence of mind. And thanks to my humble, self-extinguishing parents, enough of the independence of spirit that has to sustain independence of mind. And a line of poetry, which I'm not much given to, came to me. It's a line of Shelley's. And I think my parents would have liked it. To hope and hope and hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. They did, we must.